Double and double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. And doubly do. Extra sauce. Double and double and doubly do. 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 Double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. And doubly do. Extra sauce. Double and double and doubly do. 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 Double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. And doubly do. Extra sauce. Double and double and doubly do. 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 Double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. And doubly do. Extra sauce. Double and double and doubly do. 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 Double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and double and doubly do. Double and doubly do. And doubly do. Extra sauce. Double and double and doubly do. 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 Double and double and doobly doo.
Double and double and doubly doo.
Double and double and doobly doo. Double and doobly doo. And doobly doo. Extra sauce. Double and double and doobly doo. 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 Double and double and doobly doo.
Double and double and doubly doo.
Double and double and doobly doo. Double and doobly doo. And doobly doo. Extra sauce. Double and double and doobly doo. 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 Double and double and doobly doo.
Double and double and doubly doo.
Double and double and doobly doo. Double and doobly doo. And doobly doo. Extra sauce. Double and double and doobly doo. 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 Double and double and doobly doo.